In the spring of 1940, the land of France groaned under the crushing weight of tanked Reds. As the Wehrmacht steel torrent swept across the European continent with devastating force, driving the Allied forces to the brink of despair, the whole world held its breath in the suffocating smoke of war. On that muddy field plowed countless times by artillery fire, a tiny, almost comically shaped British tracked vehicle lay quietly paralyzed in a ditch. It did not have the majestic rotating turret of a tank, nor the thick wall-like sloped armor. Its top was completely open, making it look like a tin convertible box fitted with tracks. Its flimsy armor was pieced together from just a few millimeters of steel plates, and its compact size made it seem as though a slightly burly soldier could wrap his arms around it. A few arrogant German officers hopped down from their triumphant armored vehicles and walked up to this unimpressive little thing. One panzer commander wearing polished boots kicked the paper-thin-side armor with a mocking grin. Amidst a roar of laughter, he curled his lip in contempt, dubbing it a scrap metal toy built by the British Empire as if testing whether it was made of cardboard. However, this proud German commander had just made the most fatal cognitive error of his military career. He could never have imagined that this broken toy he was ruthlessly mocking beneath his boots was not a joke. Instead, over the long years to follow, it would transform into a tireless machine of war. It would grow at a terrifying speed to become the most produced and widely distributed armored combat vehicle in human warfare history. Its seemingly fragile body managed to outlast the invincible Nazi armored beasts. Its frantic production lines left the famous American Sherman tanks, the Soviet T-34 steel torrents, coughing in the dust. And even the Germans' own pride, the Tiger tanks, coughing in the dust of despair. From the scorching purgatory like yellow sands of North Africa to the freezing winter plains of the Soviet Union that could shatter steel. From the venomous, sweltering green hell of the Burmese jungles to the meat grinder hedgerows of Normandy, over 113,000 of these toys swarmed every major battlefield of the Second World War like locusts. This is the magnificent counterattack of the mediocre. This is the shocking legend of how a universal vehicle truly supported the skeletal structure of the Allied victory in an incredibly low-profile, yet irreplaceable way. To truly understand why this incredible miracle came to be, we must first turn back the clock and confront the ultimate nightmare that had tormented every infantry commander since the invention of the machine gun. When the trench warfare of World War I revealed the true devastation of a metal storm, the logic of war was completely rewritten. Human flesh and blood became incredibly cheap and fragile in front of machine gun nests. Capable of spewing thousands of bullets per minute, an ordinary infantryman had to carry heavy ammunition rations, a canteen, and a rifle crawling and rolling forward with great difficulty across muddy, crater-pocked open ground. Under a hail of bullets, they not only had to face shrapnel that could tear them to pieces at any moment, but also the utter despair brought on by the rapid loss of physical stamina. To solve this problem, humans invented the tank. However, by the 1930s, as the British military HICM and surveyed the approaching storm of another world war, they reached a troubling conclusion. Modern infantry advances desperately needed a vehicle. A vehicle capable of swiftly transporting heavy support weapons to the front lines across open ground, braving enemy rifle and machine gun fire. But traditional tanks were simply too expensive, too complex, and had far too high a mechanical failure rate. Using those costly, narrow-visioned behemoths as nannies and porters for the infantry was a reckless waste of resources and an absolute disaster for the logistics department to bear. What the front lines needed was not a steel beast that only knew how to charge into battle, but a hard-working, cheap, durable, and mass-producible mechanical mule. It had to be small, it had to be simple, and it had to be easily driven by ordinary recruits. Recruits who had only undergone a week or two of brief training and perhaps had never even driven a car before. Amidst countless controversial design proposals, a brilliant British engineer named John Valentine Carden and delivered a masterwork. A masterwork that stunned the era. Carden was an eccentric genius with an almost fanatical obsession with tracked vehicles coupled with extreme practical realism. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, he poured almost all his energy into developing light tanks and various chassis. He acutely sensed the military pain points and came to a conclusion that seemed quite radical at the time. You absolutely do not need tens of millimeters of heavy armor to withstand direct hits from large caliber artillery, because the purpose of this vehicle is definitely not to go head-to-head with enemy tanks. You only need a thin layer of steel, just enough to deflect standard rifle bullets and flying shrapnel, combined with an ultra-low chassis and a speed fast enough to cross the line of fire before enemy heavy weapons could aim. This was the ultimate philosophy of survival. After multiple, almost paranoid iterations and improvements, by 1938 the British War Office made a decision that completely altered the course of the war. They halted the development of all other complicated models of light transport vehicles and concentrated all resources on creating a single carrier capable of handling any task. The universal carrier was officially born. Its design blueprints were so simple that they might have offended some senior weapons experts. Its hull was pieced together from rolled homogeneous steel plates, with the thickest part being a mere 7 to 10 millimeters. By tank standards, this was as vulnerable as paper. And its completely open top made countless soldiers who saw it for the first time mutter in their hearts it sounded like a giant mobile cough, in where a well-thrown grenade or a mortar shell falling from the sky could instantly wipe out the entire crew. But facts proved that this seemingly incredibly crude design contained genius-level battlefield wisdom. The open top stripped away overhead protection, but gained three absolutely lethal advantages. First, extreme weight reduction, which pushed its speed and fuel economy to outrageous levels. Second, it provided the crew with an unparalleled 360-degree, unobstructed field of vision. On a rapidly changing battlefield, spotting the enemy first is often more important than armor thickness. Finally, and most crucially, when the vehicle was inevitably hit by anti-tank weapons and caught fire, the soldiers could bail out with incredible ease within a single second, rather than being burned alive inside an aero-dark steel can like traditional tank crews. Its incredibly low profile, barely a meter and a half, all made it move like an elusive ghost across any slightly undulating terrain, greatly increasing the difficulty for enemies trying to take a shot. The true heart of this carrier and the core secret of how it achieved such absurd production numbers was hidden within its peculiar power system. The universal carrier did not use some expensive and delicate military powertrain developed from scratch for warfare. That would have been a waste of time. The design team directly turned their sights to the most mature civilian industry in the world. At the time, automobile manufacturing. They adopted a Ford V8 flathead engine with a displacement of just under 4 liters. Yes, you heard that right. This engine, capable of outputting 85 horsepower, was originally installed in everyday civilian sedans and trucks seen everywhere on the streets. This was a stroke of strategic genius. Ford had already produced millions of these engines before the war, which meant that the world's largest and most mature production lines were already ready and waiting. It meant that its molds, its parts, and its repair tools were already in circulation in every corner of the world, whether in the British mainland or in colonies on the other side of the globe. By adopting an engine tested by countless civilian markets, British designers cleverly outsourced a complex military logistical nightmare directly to the world's most powerful civilian automotive supply chain. However, just having a strong heart was not enough. How to make this tracked vehicle run nimbly across complex battlefields was the real test. If you ask veterans who drove this carrier, they will undoubtedly describe its silky smooth driving experience with near awe. It used an externally mounted coil spring suspension system, perfectly absorbing the bumps, but also allowing the tracks to bite firmly into the earth, even on extremely rugged and broken terrain. Even more amazing was its steering system. Completely different from the complex heavy clutch and brake systems of heavy tanks that exhausted drivers, the steering was accomplished through a brilliant mechanical combination. A combination of track warping and differential braking. The driver only had an incredibly simple steering wheel in front of him, and turning it felt almost no different from driving an ordinary Ford sedan. Turn the wheel left and it accurately turned left. There was no need to yank heavy levers or require immense upper body strength. This almost intuitive driving logic made the vehicle incredibly easy to master. A farm boy who had only touched a steering wheel for a few days could drive it like a slippery loach through a hail of bullets on the chaotic battlefield. The interior layout of the Universal Carrier revealed a cold aesthetic of pragmatism. It was cleverly divided into 3 sections. The driver and commander sat at the very front, separated by the roaring Ford V8 engine. This layout intentionally, or not, turned the engine itself into an extra metallic shield protecting the front crew. In the rear half of the vehicle was a seemingly crowded, yet incredibly spacious open compartment. This space became the very soul of why this vehicle was called Universal. As long as you had the imagination, this rear cabin could be modified into absolutely anything for the war effort. The most classic form was its most widely known unofficial name, the Bren gun carrier. On the front armor plate it perfectly mounted a .303 caliber Bren light machine gun, the pride of the British Army. This killing machine, with a firing rate of up to 500 rounds per minute, could be detached directly from the vehicle and taken into battle. When on the move, it became a lethal mobile firepower platform. But if you thought it could only mount a machine gun, you vastly underestimated its transformative capabilities. Remove the machine gun and mount a massive boys and T-tank rifle to change its entire purpose. Or install a P-AT anti-tank projector firing huge-shaped charge rounds. This little transport vehicle instantly transformed into a highly mobile anti-tank sniper specializing in chewing up the flanks of enemy armor. Empty out the ammo boxes, load in stretchers and medical kits, and it became a vessel of life on the battlefield. Painted with giant red crosses, these medical carriers braved artillery fire to save lives. Dashing into no-man land, snatching countless dying wounded back from the jaws of death. Tear out the seats, stuff it full of radios and massive antennas, and it became the vital nerve center for communications. But if we were to vote for the most terrifying and psychologically devastating variant of the Universal Carrier, it would undoubtedly be the Wasp, when the Allied forces were bogged down in the labyrinthine defenses. The enemy used the dense vegetation of France to build countless hidden machine gun bunkers. Traditional infantry charges often resulted in absolutely catastrophic casualties against these fortified positions. So mad engineers ripped out the standard weapons, forcefully crammed a massive pressurized fuel tank into the vehicle, and turned this light little car into a fire-breathing beast. This was a true weapon of terror. In the foggy mornings of Normandy, an unusually low engine roar would approach. This short, tracked vehicle slid silently through the enemy blind spots like a snake slithering on the ground, utilizing its low profile. When it suddenly poked its head through a gap in the hedgerows, it did not even need precise aiming. A 30-meter-long dragon of scorching magma like fire erupted from the front nozzle, creating a literal liquid hell. The flames acted like a living creature, pouring through the gaps in the defenses, in the observation slits of the bunkers, instantly incinerating all flesh, wooden willpower in its merciless path of destruction. For the soldiers facing the Wasp, the psychological shock of watching the flames roll toward them oft and far exceeded the physical lethality of the fire itself, in front of countless notoriously tough strongholds. The mere appearance of a Wasp and a few seconds of spraying were often enough to completely break the hidden defenders, leaving them to raise their hands in absolute despair and surrender without a further fight. Let us turn our eyes back to the thrilling Dunkirk evacuation. In the summer of 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was left battered on the beaches, forced to abandon almost all their heavy equipment. That disastrous retreat, the Universal Carrier played a tragic, yet absolutely vital role. When tens of thousands of infantrymen were retreating madly toward the coastline, it was these vehicles that drove upstream. Engaging the pursuers at every crucial intersection and vital bridge, they poured out desperate firepower, with their Bren guns stubbornly dragging out the enemy advance until the main force had finally evacuated safely. Fighting until they burned their last drop of fuel and fired their last bullet, hundreds of these carriers were destroyed or driven into the sea by their desperate crews to prevent capture. But a twist occurred. The enemy who had once mocked it as a toy did not throw them into the steel furnaces as scrap after capturing them. When shrewd engineers carefully studied and tested these spoils of war, they found them incredibly useful. It was simple, rugged, and incredibly easy to maintain. Thus, the opposing forces who had always prided themselves on complex designs began to use these captured goods on a massive scale without any psychological barrier. They even mounted their own weapons on them, painted them with their own insignias, and allowed them to serve on the Eastern Front. This was undoubtedly the highest and most ironic compliment to its brilliant design. As the scale of the war expanded infinitely, even with mainland factories humming day and night, it was nowhere near enough. At this critical juncture, the original strategic vision of using civilian parts unleashed massive industrial power. Because it did not require extremely demanding military metallurgical technology, the entire overseas map was thoroughly activated. Canada quickly transformed its automobile factories into massive incubators for the war machine. Tens of thousands of carriers with chassis identical to the original models rolled off the Canadian assembly lines. Soon after, Australia and New Zealand also joined this frantic and unstoppable global production relay. For a time, any Allied factory capable of pressing steel plates and assembling engines was endlessly spitting out these machines. Even the ultimate industrial hegemon of the United States contributed to the massive production. From 1940 to the end of the war, this unimposing little vehicle multiplied at a terrifying speed like dividing cells, ultimately reaching a staggering total production of 113,000 units. This is an armored vehicle production record completely unprecedented in history and highly likely never to be surpassed. This terrifying numerical advantage gave commanders an unprecedented degree of tactical redundancy. In the endless deserts of North Africa, soldiers drove these carriers darting between sand dunes like gerbils. Their ultra-low hulls were nearly invisible amidst the glare of the sun, making them perfect for reconnaissance. Ardent veterans dared to drive them deep behind enemy lines, mapping out armored movements and speeding away safely. When the scene shifts to the suffocating, humid jungles, the dense environment was thought to stop any armor. Heavy tanks could not move an inch here, but the universal carrier traversed it like flat ground. Its incredibly low ground pressure and off-road capability allowed it to force its way through narrow, muddy forest paths. It delivered life-saving supplies to isolated troops deep behind enemy lines while simultaneously using its fierce fire to shred ambushes. The undeniable mechanical charm of this little vehicle even crossed ideological divides. Through massive supply programs, a huge number of universal carriers were shipped to the freezing snowstacks of the Soviet Union. For an army that always pursued thick armor, they were initially very skeptical of this little thing. But soon the Soviets fell in love with it. They particularly appreciated the Ford engine reliable starting ability in extreme sub-zero weather and the vehicle's simple mechanical structure. The Red Army used them extensively for frontline reconnaissance as commander vehicles and for towing light artillery. In the bloody campaigns pushing toward Berlin, you could always spot these British vehicles marked with red stars darting nimbly through the rubble of ruined cities under the cover of T-30 for tanks, carrying Soviet soldiers armed with PPS-H submachine guns. However, the creator of this great machine, John Valentine Carden, did not live to see his masterpiece shine in every corner of the world. In a tragic plane crash in 1935, the genius engineer passed away in his prime. He did not even get to see the first officially finalized universal carrier roll off the production line. Let alone imagine that his vision of simplicity is the ultimate sophistication would eventually become a backbone of steel that saved the free world. After World War II ended, while the tigers and panthers that had stolen the spotlight on the battlefield were dismantled for scrap or sent to museums for people to admire, the story of the universal carrier did not come to an end. Because of their extreme reliability and low maintenance costs, they continued to shine in regional conflicts around the globe. Amidst the swirling sands of the First Arab-Israeli War and in the biting, bone-chilling winds of the Korean Peninsula, their low, stubborn silhouettes could still be seen. Today, when military historians flip through the vast archives of World War II to examine this most brutal industrial meat grinder in human history, they invariably reach the same conclusion. The greatness of the universal carrier does not lie in how many enemy tanks it's single-handedly destroyed in a specific battle, nor in a flashy kill-to-death ratio. Its brilliance is a top-tier romance belonging to logistics and tactical application. It was like the connective tissue that bound the muscles and bones of the entire Allied war machine together. It silently took on the dirtiest, most exhausting, and most dangerous jobs on the battlefield, transporting ammo, rescuing the wounded, maintaining comms, covering retreats. With its absurdly massive numbers, it gave the Allied infantry the confidence to survive and continuously push forward on a ruthless battlefield. It was the steel silhouette that every shivering infantryman in the trenches hoped to see most in their moments of despair. From a toy mocked by the enemy to the king of production that crushed all armored myths, the universal carrier used its crude steel plates and drawing V8 engine to compose an epic of steel that belongs to the everyday hero. This is the universal carrier, the true, undisputed, uncrowned king of World War II. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history, greatest engineering miracles, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield.